In the summer of 1994, low-flying planes started crossing the skies above Los Angeles County at dawn, dropping something out of their bellies that looked, from the ground, like a strange orange snow. It wasn't snow, it was fruit flies. Millions of them, falling in soft clouds over freeway interchanges, backyards, and citrus groves. Released deliberately by the state of California in what one state assemblyman called, on the record, government-sponsored insanity. Farmers who had spent decades fighting fruit flies out of their orchards were now watching the government pay to drop more of them directly onto their crops. Except these flies were different in a way nobody could see just by looking at them. And what those flies were actually built to do would end up rewriting how the entire world fights insect invasions. This is the story of the fly army that saved California's fruit. To understand why California would ever do something that sounds this backwards, you have to understand what was actually crawling through its orchards. The Mediterranean fruit fly, known to entomologists simply as the medfly, is considered one of the most destructive agricultural pests on the planet. A female medfly can lay her eggs inside more than 250 different kinds of fruit and vegetables, and when those eggs hatch, the larvae eat their way out from the inside, turning healthy produce into a rotting, wormy mess before it ever reaches a truck, let alone a grocery shelf. The medfly isn't native to California. It isn't native to the United States at all. It hitchhikes in on imported produce, and once it establishes itself in a region with a mild climate and endless fruit, it doesn't just survive, it explodes. California had already been through this nightmare once. In 1980, a medfly infestation was discovered in the Santa Clara Valley, and the response terrified an entire state. The governor authorized helicopters to spray the pesticide malathion directly over residential neighborhoods in the middle of the night, dousing homes, cars, swing sets, and school playgrounds in a chemical fog while families slept. The public backlash was immediate and furious. Lawsuits piled up. Protesters blocked roads, and the agricultural economy of the state, worth tens of billions of dollars, sat exposed to a single insect that chemical warfare alone couldn't fully contain. By the time that outbreak was declared over, the state had spent more than $100 million, and everyone involved understood one uncomfortable fact. If the medfly ever came back, spraying poison over Los Angeles wasn't going to be an acceptable answer twice. So when new medfly infestations started popping up through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, agricultural officials went looking for something smarter. And the answer they landed on had actually been developed decades earlier, quietly, by a USDA entomologist working on an entirely different pest. His name was Edward Knipling, and back in the 1950s, he had been wrestling with the screwworm, a parasitic fly devastating cattle across the American South. Knipling had a strange idea. Instead of killing the pest, what if you sterilized it? Raise millions of the insects in a lab, expose them to a carefully calibrated dose of radiation that left them alive and otherwise normal, but biologically unable to reproduce, and then release them by the millions into the wild population. If a sterile male mates with a wild female, which happens constantly once the numbers are high enough, that female's eggs never hatch. Do that generation after generation, and the population doesn't get poisoned. It gets outcompeted into collapse, using nothing but the insect's own mating instinct against them. The method sounds almost too simple to work, and when Knipling first proposed it, most of his colleagues thought it was a fantasy, but the screwworm program proved it wasn't. Through the 1950s and 60s, sterile screwworm flies, bred and released by the billions, eliminated the screwworm entirely from the United States, a full eradication of a major agricultural pest, using nothing but biology turned against itself. It remains, to this day, one of the most successful pest control programs in history. And decades later, California's agricultural scientists looked at that old screwworm playbook and asked whether the exact same trick could work on the medfly. The logistics of doing it were staggering. To flood Los Angeles County with enough sterile flies to actually overwhelm the wild population, The state needed a facility capable of producing hundreds of millions of medflies a week. That facility exists in Hawaii at a rearing plant in Waimanalo that has been described as one of the strangest factories on Earth, an operation dedicated entirely to breeding fruit flies by the billions, feeding their larvae on custom diets in massive trays, and then, at exactly the right stage of development as pupae, blasting them with a carefully measured dose of gamma radiation. Too little radiation and the flies stay fertile. Too much and they become too weak to compete for mates in the wild. The dose has to be precise enough to sterilize without crippling, and getting that balance right took years of research. Once sterilized, the pupae are dyed with a fluorescent powder, a small internal marker, invisible in daylight but glowing under ultraviolet light, so that when a trapped fly is later examined by inspectors, they can instantly tell whether it's a wild medfly, meaning a new infestation, or one of the millions of sterile flies deliberately released as part of the program. Then the pupae are packed into cardboard boxes, flown from Hawaii to California, and loaded onto specially modified aircraft that fly low, slow grid patterns over the infested areas at dawn, releasing the flies by the millions in a steady, controlled drop. For farmers watching those planes for the first time, the whole operation looked like lunacy. Here was the state spending millions of dollars flying fruit flies in from Hawaii and dumping them directly over citrus groves that were already under quarantine because of fruit flies. Growers who had lost entire seasons of produce to medfly quarantines, unable to ship fruit across state lines while the infestation was active, watched more flies rain down over their land and assumed the government had simply lost its mind. Local news ran segments questioning the program. Farm bureaus demanded explanations. Nobody outside the entomology world understood that the flies falling from those planes had already been rendered biologically harmless before they ever left the ground. The program had to prove itself fast, because the alternative, if the sterile fly releases failed, was going back to nighttime pesticide spraying over residential Los Angeles, and nobody in state government wanted to relive 1980. So officials began releasing sterile flies continuously and preventatively across the entire Los Angeles basin, not just reacting to individual outbreaks, but blanketing the region year-round, aiming for a ratio of at least 100 sterile males for every wild male in any given area, high enough that a wild female had almost no realistic chance of finding a fertile mate. If a story like this is the kind that sticks with you, hit subscribe now, because what happened over the following years is where this stopped being a gamble and turned into one of the most quietly successful pest control programs most people have never heard of. Within the first few years of continuous sterile releases, something farmers hadn't expected began showing up in the trap data. New medfly detections across Los Angeles County started dropping, not just during active outbreaks, but as a baseline. Areas that had previously seen recurring infestations year after year stayed clear for longer and longer stretches. When new wildflies did turn up, usually from a fresh introduction hitchhiking in on imported fruit carried through an airport or mailed in a package, the sterile fly background already blanketing the region meant that new pocket of wildflies had almost nowhere to breed. Instead of spiraling into a full outbreak requiring a quarantine and emergency spraying, the infestation would simply fizzle out, unable to find enough fertile mates to establish itself before it died out on its own. The economic case became impossible to argue with. The cost of running the sterile fly program, even at the scale required to blanket the LA basin continuously, was a small fraction of what a single major outbreak and quarantine would cost the state's agricultural economy. Citrus alone represents billions of dollars in California's economy, and every county placed under a medfly quarantine loses access to interstate and international shipping until the infestation is declared eradicated, sometimes for a year or more. Compared to that kind of loss, millions of sterile flies raining out of the sky at dawn turned out to be one of the cheapest insurance policies California agriculture has ever bought. The program expanded. What started as an emergency response to specific outbreaks became a permanent, standing defense system, with regular releases continuing across the LA basin decade after decade, largely invisible to the millions of people living underneath the flight paths, who had no idea that a sky full of harmless, sterile flies was quietly protecting the produce section of every grocery store in the state. Florida, facing its own recurring medfly and related fruit fly threats, adopted similar sterile insect programs. Countries around the world, from Mexico to Guatemala to parts of the Mediterranean, built their own versions of the same system, all descended from Edward Crinty's original screwworm idea from the 1950s, the notion that you could beat an insect not by poisoning it, but by breeding it into extinction using its own instincts as the weapon. There's something genuinely strange about the scale of what's been happening quietly over Los Angeles for the past 3 decades. Somewhere in Hawaii, right now, hundreds of millions of fruit flies are being bred, fed, and irradiated in a facility most Californians have never heard of, loaded onto planes and flown across the Pacific specifically so they can be dropped deliberately over the same orchards that once demanded the state stop making things worse. And it worked, not by killing anything, but by making an entire generation of insects biologically unable to continue their own species, one silent, sterile mating at a time. The medfly never went fully extinct in California. It still turns up in isolated pockets almost every year, carried in on imported produce, discovered by an inspector's UV light catching a fly without the telltale glow. But it has never again been allowed to explode into the kind of full-blown, pesticide-spraying state of emergency crisis it caused in 1980. The sterile flies falling from the sky at dawn made sure of that, generation after invisible generation, turning the sky itself into the quietest pest control weapon California has ever deployed. So the next time a plane passes low and slow over a California orchard at sunrise, it's worth remembering what might actually be falling out of it. Not poison, not a threat. Just millions of flies engineered to lose, deployed on a single mission to make absolutely certain there's no next generation waiting behind them. What do you think California should target next using this same trick? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this is the kind of story that changes how you look at the world around you, subscribe for more unbelievable but true stories exactly like this one every single week.